It's been some 60 years since the United States added 2 new stars to Old Glory's Field of Blue. Alaska became our 49th state in January of 1959. Hawaii, our 50th, in August of the same year. So is it time for 51? We ask our Mo Rocca to consider the debate over making Washington, D.C. our newest state.
It's made official at the White House. Hawaii's half-century-old request for statehood is granted.
In 1959, when Hawaii became the 50th state,
truly an historic occasion.
It was the conclusion of a decades-long fight.
Another new flag with 9 rows of stars. Another new look for Old Glory.
To be sure, there had been fierce political opposition.
We would have in the American Congress 2 senators and a representative who, in my judgment, would be influenced by the Communist Party.
And questions about whether Hawaiians could ever be real Americans.
The yellow race, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Filipinos, their background is not the culture of the United States as a whole.
As one who does not belong to the Caucasian stock.
But future U.S. Senator Daniel Inouye, who'd lost his right arm in World War II, had a ready response.
During the last war, World War II and Korean conflict, we lost 4 times more men than the average of the United States. I think we've been begging for statehood too long.
62 years later and 5,000 miles away, there's another battle for statehood being waged.
The bill is passed.
In April, the U.S. House passed a bill to grant statehood to Washington, D.C. The measure is unlikely to survive the Senate, but the issue is not about to die. With more than 700,000 residents, almost half of whom are African American, the District of Columbia has a bigger population than either Wyoming or Vermont. Residents here pay federal taxes, more per capita than any state. They can vote for president, but they have no voting representation in Congress.
I was outraged, completely outraged and angry.
Hector Rodriguez moved to Washington in 1968 after serving in the U.S. Army.
Even when I was in the military on active duty, I could vote. And when I arrived in D.C., suddenly I realized that I didn't have my full freedom.
We met him at one of the city's lesser-known monuments, the D.C. War Memorial, honoring 500 of the some 6,000 district residents who've given their lives for their country.
I felt, as a soldier who had served my country, that I was not treated equally.
This is the only capital city in the world where the residents who live in their capital don't have the same rights as everybody else in the country.
No one has been slugging it out for D.C. statehood longer than Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Home rule. I will not yield, sir. The District of Columbia has spent 206 years yielding to people who would deny them the vote. I yield you no ground.
She's represented the district as a delegate for more than 30 years, though she's not allowed to vote on legislation.
For 3 generations, my family has been denied the rights other Americans take for granted.
Her grandfather was a D.C. firefighter working in a segregated unit.
My father was a civil servant. My mother was a school teacher in the District of Columbia Public Schools.
Did you know growing up that residents of D.C. had this unusual status?
I certainly knew it from the time we were children. Because you lived in the nation's capital, you had no voting rights. It was as if you didn't live in America.
The question over D.C. voting rights stretches back to the beginnings of Washington itself. The Constitution called for the formation of a federal district independent of any state to serve as the nation's capital. Land was ceded from Maryland and Virginia for the 100-square-mile District of Columbia on the banks of the Potomac River. There were already people living there, in the existing towns of Georgetown and Alexandria, and soon in a brand new one called Washington, which, by the way, is why it's written out Washington, D.C. But the Constitution had nothing to say about their rights to representation.
They had just founded a country on the principle of no taxation without representation. So they realized that they've got two competing principles when it comes to the District of Columbia.
Historian George Derek Musgrove, co-author of Chocolate City, A History of D.C., says the irony was not lost on the Founding Fathers.
They debate it and they debate it, and Madison finally just throws up his hands and says, I know that any state that cedes the land for the district will in fact figure out how to make sure that these people are represented.
He just punts.
He punts, essentially.
In 1847, the portion of D.C. south of the Potomac retroceded to Virginia, in part because Alexandria's slave traders feared that slavery would be outlawed in the district, giving the city its current shape. It wasn't until the 1990s when statehood for the district became a real political movement. But at the time, the city was deemed ungovernable by statehood opponents. Mayor Marion Barry made national headlines when he was caught in an FBI sting smoking crack cocaine.
The district, a liberal bastion of corruption and crime, has yet to come even close, in this member's eyes, to deserving the awesome privilege and responsibility of statehood.
The city was on the verge of bankruptcy. We had one of the highest murder rates in the entire country in 1993. So these were serious problems that people used as an excuse to reject statehood legislation.
Democrats, who in 1993 had the White House and both houses of Congress, gave only tepid support to a D.C. statehood bill, which died a quiet death. But today the district is a very different place. While homicides have risen over the last few years, they're well below the early 90s peak, and the city is today on firm financial footing.
We're moving into what's known as the cellar, so this is where the actual act of fermentation happens.
Thor Cheston is the owner of Right Proper Brewing. He and 22-year-old Jamal Holtz are part of a new generation of activists.
I'm trying to function as a small business, and I don't have someone in Congress that's going to fight for me, that's going to fight for my business because it's in Washington, D.C.
This issue, for me, it's personal. My mom did not have full health care, and she was uninsured. So the day where everyone was like, call your senator, reach out to your representative and tell them to vote for the Affordable Care Act, it was the day where I knew I was voiceless.
You cannot skirt the Constitution.
But opponents of the statehood bill say not so fast, and they're invoking the Constitution.
There's no power in Congress to turn the district into a new 51st state. The only way this can be done is through a constitutional amendment.
Roger Pilon is a legal scholar with the Cato Institute.
It's clear that the people in the District of Columbia want a vote. There's only one way under current circumstances that they can do that. They will have to move to a new state.
There are people in the district that have been here for many generations. Does that make any difference?
Constitutionally, no.
What do you say to the argument that if you care this much about voting rights, move to another state?
I am almost speechless. You can't just pick up your life. People don't have that option.
Statehood is also a matter of civil rights.
This is full-bore socialism on the march in the House.
But the real battle is a bare-knuckled partisan one over control of a closely divided Senate.
They want 2 seats in perpetuity in the United States Senate.
In 2020, 92% of residents here voted for Joe Biden. A new state would almost certainly add 2 more Democrats to the Senate. No surprise that opposition to statehood is almost exclusively Republican. You've got to love that prospect of 2 more Democrats in the Senate. How much does that motivate you?
Well, that motivates me a lot. We need 2 more Democrats in the Senate.
While the drive for statehood may have stalled in Congress, The very people who live in the shadow of the Capitol are not about to throw in the towel. In a 2016 referendum, a record high 86% of D.C. residents registered their support for statehood.
Why it matters is it's almost as though the country is not yet complete.
It feels like disenfranchisement, that your voice does not matter. And it's time that we make sure that our vote counts.